The paper was stamped, signed, and quietly filed under government ink that was never meant for public eyes. It did not describe a battle. It described a performance. A hijacked airliner that never actually existed. A bombed civilian aircraft, staged in imagination before it ever touched reality. False headlines already written in advance. Coffins that would never need to be filled, but grief carefully engineered anyway. In the cold machinery of 1962 Washington, a question was not being asked out loud. It was being drafted in silence. What if a war could be started without a war actually happening? And in that silence, a plan began to take shape that would later be known as Operation Northwoods. A war written like fiction, signed like fact, and buried like it never happened. But buried documents have a habit of resurfacing, and when they do, they don't whisper, they echo. The year was 1962. The Cold War was no longer cold in feeling, only in name. Every shadow carried the weight of nuclear possibility. Cuba had become a pressure point, a geographic spark resting just 90 miles from Florida, close enough to feel like proximity was provocation. Inside the Pentagon, the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff were not thinking in terms of diplomacy alone. They were thinking in probabilities, contingencies, escalation ladders, each rung measured in national survival. And somewhere in that architecture of strategy, Operation Northwoods was born. It did not begin with chaos. It began with paperwork, typed memoranda, clean margins, precise language designed to make extreme ideas sound like administrative options. The proposal, developed under the Joint Chiefs in coordination with defense planners, outlined scenarios intended to justify military intervention in Cuba, not through direct provocation alone, but through manufactured incidents that would appear to be Cuban aggression. The language was clinical, detached, almost surgical in tone. Ideas included simulated or staged attacks, false flag operations designed to shift public perception. Civilian targets were referenced not as lives, but as instruments of narrative pressure. Aircraft incidents were described as pretext events. Public reaction was treated as a predictable variable, something that could be guided, shaped, and ultimately leveraged. The logic was not emotional, it was strategic. If public support was the missing piece for escalation, then public perception itself became the battlefield. No missiles were launched, but scenarios were drafted where they might appear to be. In the quiet offices where Northwoods took form, war was not being declared. It was being designed as a story that others would believe they were witnessing. And like all stories built in secrecy, it relied on one critical assumption, that it would never be read aloud. In the files of Operation Northwoods, war was not a single act. It was a menu, a list of possibilities arranged with bureaucratic calm, as if each line item were just another policy option, rather than a potential trigger for global catastrophe. The planners did not begin with chaos. They began with control. Control of perception, control of narrative, control of the moment when a nation decides what it believes is true. And so, the document expanded into scenarios, not battlefield engagements in the traditional sense, but staged events designed to imitate them so convincingly that no distinction could be drawn in real time between attack and invention. One proposal described the possibility of sabotaging or faking the destruction of a U.S. aircraft. The idea was not simply loss, but visibility, a tragedy designed to be seen, reported, and emotionally absorbed before investigation could catch up to reality. Another outlined the concept of orchestrating incidents that would be attributed to Cuba, including fabricated acts of aggression against American interests. The intent was not to prove hostility, but to simulate it with enough clarity that public outrage would feel organic. Even more disturbing were the suggestions involving civilian vessels and commercial aircraft. The language described discrete events that could be staged in international waters or airspace, engineered to produce the impression of unprovoked Cuban action. In one of the most infamous concepts, there was the suggestion of a fake attack on the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Not an actual assault, but a constructed narrative of one. Explosions that would not be attributed to Cuban forces in reality, but would be made to appear that way through timing, signals, and information control. Each scenario followed the same internal logic. If Cuba could be made to appear responsible for American deaths or attacks, then public sentiment would shift. And if public sentiment shifted, military action would no longer feel like escalation. It would feel like response. The document even acknowledged the psychological architecture required. Words like credibility, public perception, and media exploitation appeared alongside operational concepts, not as afterthoughts, but as core components of the strategy itself. This was not just about creating an incident, it was about creating belief. Somewhere inside that logic was a quiet transformation of warfare itself, no longer confined to borders or missiles, but extending into the fragile space between what happens and what people are told has happened. And yet, despite its severity, Operation Northwoods never left the planning stage, because in another room, at another level of authority, the proposal met resistance, not from enemies abroad, but from within. A line was drawn that would not be crossed, and in that moment, the plan stopped being a blueprint for action and became a record of intent, filed away, classified, forgotten by many, until decades later, when the archive opened again and the shape of what had been proposed could no longer be unseen. In Washington, documents rarely die. They wait. Operation Northwoods did not vanish when it left the drafting table. It traveled upward through the chain of command, carried in folders, briefed in rooms where the air always seemed slightly too controlled, where decisions were made not with urgency, but with deliberate stillness. At the Pentagon, the proposal reached the highest military leadership. The Joint Chiefs had shaped it, refined it, and presented it as a set of strategic options for consideration in the escalating pressure surrounding Cuba. And then, it moved beyond them, into civilian authority, into the office of the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. McNamara was no stranger to systems thinking. He understood metrics, escalation models, the logic of deterrence. But what he was being asked to evaluate here was not simply military strategy. It was narrative construction as a weapon, a war justified through events designed to appear real rather than be real. From there, the proposal reached President John F. Kennedy, and something shifted. The White House was already a pressure chamber of Cold War tension. The Cuban Missile Crisis would erupt the following year. But even before that peak, the atmosphere was already saturated with suspicion, intelligence reports, and competing visions of how far the United States should go in confronting Cuba and its alignment with the Soviet Union. But Operation Northwoods crossed a different boundary, not just tactical, ethical. The proposal suggested, in essence, that American institutions could stage violence against their own people or fabricate attacks in order to manufacture justification for war. It was the inversion of defense logic, not responding to threats, but creating the appearance of them. Kennedy reviewed the material, and according to the historical record, he rejected it. There was no public announcement, no press conference, no formal condemnation. That is not how documents like this disappear. Instead, it was quietly denied, set aside, and never authorized for execution. The plan did not fail in action. It failed in approval. And that distinction is what kept it from becoming reality. Within the machinery of government, rejection does not always mean destruction. It often means containment. The document remained classified, preserved in archives where it would sit untouched for decades, known only to a limited circle of historians and researchers until its eventual declassification in the 1990s. When it finally emerged into public view, it did not arrive with sound or spectacle. It arrived as a file, a series of pages that revealed how close the architecture of perception and warfare had once come to overlapping completely. For many, it was shocking not because it showed what was done, but because it showed what was seriously considered. And in that realization, Operation Northwoods became something more than a historical footnote. It became a mirror, reflecting a moment when the boundary between strategy and fabrication was briefly treated as negotiable. Then, just as quietly, it was drawn again, and this time, it held. For decades, Operation Northwoods lived exactly where it was designed to live, nowhere in public memory. It sat inside classified archives, untouched by the world it had once been intended to influence. Not erased, not destroyed, simply sealed away, like a thought the system decided it should never finish thinking. Then came the 1990s. A wave of declassifications began to peel back Cold War secrecy, one folder at a time. Among nuclear strategies, intelligence assessments, and historical memos, researchers stumbled across a document that didn't fit neatly into the familiar patterns of deterrence or defense. It read like something else entirely. Not a response to war, but a plan to simulate one. Operation Northwoods emerged into public view not with ceremony, but with quiet shock. Historians and journalists reviewed the language line by line, trying to understand how seriously it had been considered inside the U.S. military structure. What made it unsettling was not just its content, but its normality on paper. The tone was bureaucratic, controlled, the kind of language that belongs in planning rooms, not moral debates. There were no dramatic admissions attached to it, no explanation from the officials who had once signed or reviewed it. Just the document itself, standing on its own, stripped of context except for time. Public reaction was immediate but uneven. Some saw it as evidence of Cold War paranoia pushed to its edge. Others pointed out that it was ultimately rejected, arguing that the system had worked as intended by stopping it before execution. But a deeper question lingered underneath the headlines. If such ideas could be formally written, reviewed, and advanced through the highest levels of military planning, what did that say about the boundary between strategy and illusion? Operation Northwoods did not become history because it was carried out. It became history because it was nearly acceptable enough to be proposed at all. And once revealed, it forced a quieter reflection on how modern conflicts are shaped, not only by weapons, but by narratives, perception, and the controlled framing of events before the public ever sees them. In that sense, the document did not stay in the past. It leaked forward, into the way people now question information, intelligence, and the stories that arrive fully formed on screens before verification can catch up. Northwoods, as a plan, ended in rejection, but as a concept, it left something behind. A reminder that in the modern world, the first battlefield is often not physical. It is perceptual, and what is believed can move faster than what is proven. Operation Northwoods never became a war, but it never became nothing either. That is the strange tension it leaves behind. A plan drafted with enough detail to feel executable, a chain of approval that carried it upward through the most powerful offices in the United States military structure, and then a final refusal that stopped it before it crossed into action. No explosions followed it, no staged disasters, no fabricated headlines engineered in real time, only silence and paperwork. And yet, even in silence, something lingers. Because Northwoods exposed something uncomfortable about how modern power operates when it is under pressure. Not that it always acts on its most extreme ideas, but that those ideas can exist long enough to be formalized, discussed, and reviewed without immediate collapse. It forces a difficult distinction between intention and execution, between what is proposed and what is permitted. When the document was later declassified, it did not arrive as a revelation of action, but as a glimpse into the edge of decision-making itself, a place where strategic thinking, fear, and political urgency briefly converged into ideas that blurred the line between defense and fabrication. And that is where its weight actually sits, not in what happened, but in what was briefly treated as thinkable. Over time, Operation Northwoods has been pulled into broader conversations about trust, government transparency, and the psychology of conflict. Some view it as a cautionary artifact of Cold War extremity. Others see it as evidence that perception itself has always been part of the battlefield, long before the internet made information instant and unstable. But the most enduring impact is quieter than both of those interpretations. It is the way it changes how people read official narratives, not with automatic disbelief, but with awareness that the construction of events is rarely as simple as it appears at the surface. Northwoods becomes less about conspiracy and more about capability. what systems can design under pressure, and what they ultimately choose not to do. Because in the end, the story does not rest on execution. It rests on restraint, a line drawn inside a closed room that prevented an idea from becoming reality. And once that line was drawn, it did not erase the document. It only defined it as something that almost entered the world and then stayed just outside of it. Some stories are remembered for what happened. This one is remembered for what almost did. Operation Northwoods sits in that narrow space where imagination meets authority, where strategy briefly outruns ethics, and where the system itself becomes aware of its own creative power. Not everything that can be designed is destined to exist, and not every idea that reaches paper ever reaches the world. But once something is written down with enough seriousness, it stops being just thought. It becomes possibility. And possibility has a long memory, even when the file is closed, even when the plan is rejected, even when the room goes quiet again. The dusty ledger does not end with certainty here. It ends with a reminder. History is not only what happened, it is also what was nearly allowed to. And sometimes, that is the part that echoes the longest.